It's time for the District 4 Report, presented to you by Professor Diggs himself, only on PiloPointBearcats.com. Class begins now.
Thank you, as always, for that wonderful, rousing introduction from the studios in Pilot Point, Texas. I am Professor Diggs, here with the 4-3A Report, the first of what hopefully is many playoff editions of the 4-3A report. And you heard last week I mentioned to you that I would be making that trip up 377 and I would go check out the scene up there and some of my first impressions, and I'm sure this is not a huge surprise for any of you listening to the 4-3A report who live up there, but the way it had me go is it had me take Lake Forest off of 380, take that up to some farm to market road, head on over to Pilot Point, and what really surprised me was how big Salina was. I mean, I was just blown away at how developed Salina was. And you hear reports that Salina is going to be 6A within 4 to 6 years, and they're going to have to build a second high school. But until you see the subdivisions and the rapid growth out there, it's just really hard to believe. Because who's cruising out that way, unless you're going to Pilot Point, which I believe everyone should be going to Pilot Point at some point. But went over to Pilot Point to check out that scene. And we've got to thank our good friends over at Uncle Beto's who provided some fajitas, some great food. They have they have black beans and white rice and great steak and great grilled onions, and their chips and salsa are to die for. I'd like to thank our friends over at Uncle Beto's for helping us out, or El Beto del Tio, if you will listen to my Duolingo, which if you do, you probably don't want to listen to my Duolingo work, but I know Tio means uncle. But I got over there and got a chance to meet with Coach David and America's favorite assistant coach, Coach Marsh. Got to see our friends from Sideline to Sideline over there, Grant and Terry, always good to see them. Got to see Leighton Prater, the new Denton Record Chronicle guy who got assigned to that game at the last minute. It really just felt like home. I haven't been to Massey Stadium in probably 10 years. They had a lot of fun over in Pilot Point. And the goal was just to go over there just for a few minutes till about 6:45, make that 18-minute drive north and be in Whitesboro. But 377 was shut down because of what people have said might have been a fatality accident. For those of you who live up there, you might know about this. Definitely don't want to put any sort of don't want to ridicule that or share frustration when somebody's life and a whole family and kind of a network of when somebody dies, how that impacts a community in an area. So I don't want to disrespect that. But I got to do some off-roading off into the Pilot Point suburbs to try to get around that and get over to Tioga. But by the time all of that happened, it was about 6:45. It was about 7:45. It took me about an hour to bypass that accident and get over to Whitesboro. And at that point, Whitesboro was already up 13-0. And what Whitesboro did, what I visually got to see Whitesboro do, was just absolutely incredible. I mean, they really impressed me. More so than I had been expecting. I expected them to beat Peaster, but they were beating Peaster kind of like the way Brock was beating Peaster. And if you go back and look at that game with Whitesboro and Pilot Point and double overtime, and Pilot Point had to do a lot of things right in the second half to make that a game that got into overtime, and then the execution that they had in overtime, and second overtime, to win that game. Just all credit to Pilot Point. But you probably heard me say last week when we were doing our District 4-3A report that the game between Brock and Pilot Point would help me calibrate Jim Ned and Brock at 1 and 2, and it would help me calibrate Pilot Point and Bushland at 3 and 4. And ladies and gentlemen, I am here to tell you, and I'm a little surprised I'm saying this, but I think the eye test is the most important thing you can do. I think Whitesboro is the third best team in this region at this point. Whitesboro just dominated in multiple ways. I liked what they did on defense. I liked the big play offensive capabilities they had. And if you look at them and kind of what they've done all year, they've really flown all under the radar. And Coach Fagan might not be happy to hear me hype up that. I think they kind of like flying under the radar. To a certain extent. But if you want my dark horse in this tournament coming up, Whitesboro, I think, might have a chance to make it to the regional final. And if you look at what Whitesboro did against Brock relative to what Pilot Point did against Brock, Whitesboro played Brock better. So, in some ways, this is not a big surprise. And Whitesboro had a great week. Their cross-country team won state. Their band made it third in state. They're very happy. That place was packed. I mean, this is my first time going to Whitesboro and seeing that scene. Coach Fagan's got something special down there. I had a chance to go talk to Coach Fagan after the game, and he believed they're peaking at the right time, that this was their best overall performance of the year. Really just impressive for Whitesboro. So if you want a dark horse in Region 1, when we're talking about all of these things, how about Whitesboro? I think the Bearcats that are not being talked about are the Bearcats, a little up 377 over into Whitesboro. So let's talk about what I thought was going to happen last week and what actually did happen. I thought Whitesboro would beat Peaster by a touchdown. Again, they won pretty convincingly, 52-9. And that game was not close. It was 52-2 at one point. Peaster scored a garbage touchdown in the fourth quarter. Whitesboro's second team, even when they substituted their quarterback in, they were playing better. And poor Gunnar McElroy was just running for his life all night. Whitesboro's defense, I think, is pretty underrated as well. Bowie against Boyd. Bowie has had a tough season, and Boyd just took care of business. I had them winning by 21. They won by 42. I thought Paradise and Ponder would be much closer. Paradise took care of business 42-21 in that game. And then the Pilot Point Brock game I thought would be closer. And it was through a half. For a while, I was really regretting going up to Whitesboro Peaster because it was 14-7 at halftime over there at Pilot Point Brock. But Brock took care of business in the second half, winning that game 47-13. Let's break down some of those games a little bit, and we'll start out with the district championship in a game. This is a game that was 14-7 at halftime. Really got away from Pilot Point in the second half, where Brock just completely dominated them. And one thing I heard up at the press box over in Whitesboro was that they were talking about how they were glad they didn't want to be district champions because they recognized how good Jim Ned was, and that if you're in that part of the bracket, if you're the fourth place team or any of the other teams, you'd have to beat Brock and Jim Ned. But if you are on the other half of the bracket, you only had to beat Brock or Jim Ned, depending on who got out of that region. And that's a good point, because winning two tough games like that is incredibly hard. Like if there was a dark horse in that half of the bracket, they're going to have to beat both of them. And I don't think there's anybody within 5 touchdowns of those two teams on that side of the bracket. But obviously, it's just a much harder road on that half of the bracket. But I think that when I'm looking at the Brock Pilot Point game, Cutter Wilson had himself a night. 26 carries for 341 yards and 3 touchdowns. Nathan Jones was pretty much unstoppable, 5 receptions for 103 yards and a touchdown. Let's give a shout out to Ish Harris. We know his talent because, obviously Texas A&M would not recruit a player that didn't have talent, but he hadn't been putting up big numbers this year. And a couple of thought processes with that is that, you got to think the big picture. If Pilot Point is going to have an extended playoff run, you might not want to wear him down. He might have been coming off an injury or something that people aren't talking about, or coaches are trying to keep under wraps and just kind of get him healthy and that sort of a thing. Or perhaps they're saving him for the playoffs and, just kind of rotating other players in, and when it's playoff time, it's ish time. But either way, he kind of got things ramped up a little bit against Brock. Had 20 carries for 101 yards and a touchdown, also 3 receptions for 48 yards and a touchdown. And Brock really did a good job. How many times have we been talking about the video game numbers, one of those words, of Aiden Cox? He had 301 yards the week before. He was held to 6 receptions for 35 yards. And I get at some level that Pilot Point, this game wasn't as important to them because they might have had the Whitesboro philosophy of, we're going to have to beat this team again, let's not show them too much. But I would have liked for Pilot Point, if I was going to get excited about this outcome, and for the first half I would like to see a little bit more defensive pride. Giving up 615 yards over 64 plays, giving up 10 yards a rush, 10 yards in overall play, just really isn't what I wanted to see from Pilot Point if I'm going to get excited about Pilot Point being a team that can win this region and pull an improbable upset in the regional finals. And Whitesboro showed me that kind of mentality. I think they showed me that they had enough on both sides of the ball to maybe get a team that had to put everything on the field in the third round, whereas Whitesboro might be coasting a little bit, or Pilot Point, depending on how it goes. But I'm just more impressed with Whitesboro right now, having seen them in person. Granted, I've not seen Pilot Point in person play a full game, but what I saw with Whitesboro was pretty impressive. As I mentioned, when I got there, it was 13-0, and it just continued. Mac Harper went 9 of 10 for 346 yards and 6 touchdowns. I mean, it was long ball offense all night. They only had 33 plays. I mean, it was just something that was incredible, whereas Peaster had 72 plays because they were just trying to get something done all night. And just Peaster was going for it on 4th down, and it was taking them 4 plays to get, just eke out that 10 yards every single time. It was just an incredible defensive performance. The big offensive star on the reception side for Whitesboro was Jay Sanders, 4 receptions for 183 yards and 3 touchdowns. Jacob Hermes, 3 for 75 and 2 touchdowns. And Sean Shears, 2 for 111 and 1 touchdown. Asher Contreras, I really liked him at running back. Tough runner, 7 for 86 and 1 touchdown. We're talking about a team that ran up 525 yards. And if you look at Peaster, you look at them and go, okay, Gunnar McElroy, 24 for 35, 250 yards and a touchdown. Let me tell you, folks, that was in garbage time. I mean, it was not a competitive game whatsoever at all until Peaster maybe got 150 of those 250 yards in the fourth quarter against Whitesboro's backups. Whitesboro just completely flipped the script for me in how I would deem Region 1. Boyd versus Bowie. Again, we've talked about Rendon Lamance all year long, and he didn't fail to live up to his expectation. 10 for 13 for 107 yards. Did throw an interception. But on the rushing side of the ball, 20 carries for 218 yards and 2 touchdowns as Boyd wins the last game and gets to end the season on a high, beating Bowie 48-6. And then Ponder versus Paradise. Paradise with a 42-21 win. We talked about how Ponder's youth, kind of monitor a couple of those players. Clifton Cooper, 29 for 42, 294 yards. 2 touchdowns and 2 interceptions. Paradise's defense has been one of the underrated aspects of their team this year. They're very good at forcing turnovers. Just couldn't win any of those Big Four games against the 4 playoff teams, and they were competitive in 3 of those 4 games. Just 1-score losses, couldn't convert. Clifton Cooper rushing the ball, 14 carries for 26 yards, really speaks to that Paradise defense. And Case Peacock, the sophomore, 9 receptions for 87 yards, and Colby Murphy, the sophomore, 8 receptions for 115 yards. So if you are a Ponder fan, you're very excited about what's coming back. Paradise, very senior-heavy team. We'll have to see what they can build back next year. It was 28-14 at halftime, and then they finished it off in the fourth quarter to win 42-21. So as we said last week, we're saying goodbye to Boyd, Bowie, Ponder, and Paradise. No more, no more talk of Ponder Paradise, Boyd Bowie. The P's and the B's are now gone. Have a great basketball season. From what I understand, Ponder has a good basketball team. So enjoy, friends. And next year, if we do the 4-3A report again this next year, well, and who knows what it will look like. We got realignment coming up in February, how all of this will work out. So probably at the very least, the last time we will have the 4-3A report with this batch of 8 teams, as realignment will definitely shake things up. So let's talk a little bit about what's going to happen this week and kind of how I view the region. A big game last week, Early and Wall. Early had a great fourth quarter to force a 3-way tie by beating Wall by 10. Completely flipping the script on how things were going to go there. Jim Ned, obviously the number 1 seed, but Breckenridge, by way of that 3-way tie, ends up getting the 2nd seed, with Early getting the 3rd seed and Wall then getting a nice consolation game against Brock. So this week we're going to have Jim Ned against Peaster, Early against Pilot Point, Wall against Brock, and Breckenridge versus Whitesboro. Obviously, the 2 big games that are the more competitive games, Jim Ned is going to blast Peaster, and Brock is going to blast Wall. But Early and Pilot Point and Breckenridge and Whitesboro, I think, are the teams that are the 2 games of note. And really, Breckenridge, if you remember, we've talked about them a few weeks ago in the District 4-3A report. This is a team that's coming on strong. They're peaking at the right time, too. So you got Breckenridge peaking at the right time and Whitesboro peaking at the right time. But for me, I'm really a big fan of what Whitesboro is doing. I'll be taking Whitesboro in that game. Early versus Pilot Point is an interesting game because Early, when you looked at what Breckenridge did against them, Breckenridge blasted them pretty good, but Early is still an 8-2 team, and Pilot Point has had some of the problems that we've talked about. I think that's a 1-score game. I think Whitesboro has a chance to handle Breckenridge pretty convincingly, but Early and Pilot Point, that's an upset watch for me because Pilot Point has, again, there's just something missing when you look at what Pilot Point does week in and week out. I don't know if it's the infrastructure of the offensive line, defensive line, because obviously their skill players are fantastic. Quarterback, running back, and a couple of the receivers are fantastic, but defensively, obviously getting cash for 10 yards a run against Brock is very telling. I don't know how tough they are defensively, especially on the front 7. So this is a little bit of a worrisome game. Early has a lot of confidence, and maybe they kind of figured it out because after Breckenridge blasted them a few weeks ago. So Pilot Point, you're on upset watch with this game. I think I'm going to pick you Pilot Point, but I'm not feeling great about this game. I'm feeling a lot better about Whitesboro and Breckenridge. And that end, when you kind of start breaking down the bracket and how everything is going to end up looking, you could see a Whitesboro, we know we're going to have Jim Ned and Brock most likely in that 3rd round, but things could kind of break down to where you've got Pilot Point and Whitesboro in that third round as well. And I will probably go see that game because I think if they make it to that end, but again, it's not going to be an easy road because Shallow Water and Pilot Point, that's kind of a 50-50 thing. Obviously, Bushland and Whitesboro, Bushland will be a favorite for many, and that's what I was talking about. I think Whitesboro really has a chance to shock this region because what I saw, they are an underrated team, and I think that they have a chance to get to that 3rd round and potentially the 4th round. I would have them, from what I saw, I think Whitesboro is that team to win this top half of the bracket. Of course, as you hear, as we get more data in, things are subject to change as always. But I do believe that Whitesboro is a team that everybody is not talking about, that everybody should be talking about on that top half of the bracket. They are a good team. A storyline we've been talking about all year is the Jim Ned versus Brock game and how that's going to work out. I needed Brock to beat to win by more than Jim Ned did this week. Jim Ned won by 28 against Clyde, and Brock. There was a point where they'd only won by they're only up by 27, and then they got a little bit of a special teams play. They got an onside kick again. When you look at the fact that they were down 21-14 and then poured it on, winning the second half 34-6, you could really see the fact that Brock wanted to make a statement and let everybody know that they are the number one team in the state, and it goes through them. So they got my vote now, at least against Jim Ned. Jim Ned has kind of shown themselves to not be as strong over the last few weeks. Like, they've kind of every week, every time the scores come by, they're winning just enough. And they kind of remind me of a 5A team, Denton Ryan, the way they're playing, if you follow 5A football, where they're not winning these games with the big scores like Brock is. Frisco Lone Star in that region was winning those games, but then when they played this week, you had a 7-6 game with Denton Ryan beating Lone Star just with that defensive style of football. So I think of that game, and I wonder if Jim Ned is playing that kind of offense and defense to where we're not really going to see, unless we're watching them, the quality of football that they're playing. But have they really been tested this year? Whereas I think Brock has had a couple of tests to get them going. So I think Brock on paper has earned that to be the favorite over Jim Ned. But is Jim Ned kind of giving us a little bit of the rope-a-dope and sandbagging us? I guess time will tell when it comes to that. But I think as of today, you got to give Brock the advantage over Jim Ned. And right now, I said I was going to decide who's going to get the advantage with Bushland and Pilot Point. Well, after seeing Whitesboro, I'm upgrading them to be the team that I think will be win the other half of that bracket, and will face the winner of Jim Ned and Brock. But you know what? It's football, and next week, Breckenridge is certainly capable of beating Whitesboro, and we might come back here, throw our papers up in the air, and recalibrate it all again, and that's the great thing about high school football. There have been many times where a computer poll has made a team a 30 or 40-point favorite, and they should have been, but 4 or 5 turnovers and a couple of special teams plays completely changed things. Just 3 games immediately that come off to mind. Lubbock Coronado and Amarillo Tascosa. Amarillo Tascosa had 6 turnovers in that game. They lose. They were highly favored. McKinney North and Longview. Longview was about a 30-point favorite. 4 turnovers. McKinney North wins that game, and then the next week, Longview comes and beats John Tyler, or I guess just Tyler now, Tyler High, 49-0. And then Lovejoy against Frisco Liberty. Frisco Liberty was a 30-point underdog. They had lost to Frisco by 36, and Lovejoy had beat Frisco by 28. So what happens this week when they play? Frisco Liberty executes a perfect offensive game plan, death by 1,000 cuts, and they beat Lovejoy. All of this to say, I know that's not District 4 3A talk, but it's playoffs. Anything can happen in the playoffs. That's why they play the games. That's why they don't just have me fill out the bracket and sign a check for the winner. You got to earn it on the field. And all of these things with a weird weather week or just one thing can completely change the dynamics. But that's how things look this week, and next week we'll tell you how things look next week. So for all of our friends at Pilot Point, all of our friends at Uncle Beto's, and all of the District 4 3A teams that have made the playoffs, thank you for tuning in to another District 4 3A report. I'm going to kick it to our friends in Pilot Point at the studios who will play me out. We'll see you next week.